Welcome to this special look at one of the many historic sites near the spirit of the Suwannee Music Park. Today, we're exploring the Confederate Railroad, a piece of history tucked away in the beautiful Florida wilderness. Just a short hike from the Suwannee Canoe Outpost, this site sits right next to the fascinating Indian Trail Tree, a natural marker used by the Native Americans centuries ago. Whether you're here for the history or the scenic trails, this area offers a unique glimpse into the past, all within reach of the park. Let's take a closer look. Welcome back to another edition of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm Satoli. Today we're in Florida, and I'm with Ken Sulak, one of the historians of Northern Florida. Is that right, or the all over state of Florida?
North Florida.
North Florida?
Yeah, North Florida.
So right behind us, we've got some massive railroad abutments and piers. What's this all about?
Well, back in 1861, after the southern states seceded, Robert E. Lee recommended that they needed to have a railroad connector between Georgia and Florida so that they could get beef and cattle and leather and shoes and rice and sugar and salt from Florida, which was the storehouse of the Confederacy, up to where the battles were going on in Georgia and South Carolina and the like, because the soldiers needed food and they needed all kinds of equipment. And so Lee recommended that they build this connector somewhere between the East-West Railroad going across Florida that was just completed in 1860 and the East-West Railroad across southern Georgia, the Savannah, Albany, and Atlantic Railroad. And so they started to build this connector. It's 46 miles long. And from Lawton, Georgia, one of the stations on the Georgia line, to Florida. There was no station in Florida yet. And Live Oak, the town right here 7 miles away, came into existence because it ended up being the junction between the north-south connector and the main line across North Florida.
Okay.
And so that way they could ship things across state and then up the connector. Well, as it turns out, on the Georgia side, rails were short. The Confederacy didn't have much in the way of manufacturing capability. So they ripped out rails from one of the branch lines up in Georgia and used those for their section down to the Suwannee River here. And in Florida, the Confederate Army commandeered the rails from Mr. Yulee's East-West Florida Railroad that was partly torn up already by Union soldiers. But Yulee was not happy about that. And so he fought them in court for 3 years. And finally there was a standoff between the county sheriffs in Florida and the Army being a bigger entity, won out, and they took the rails. And they finished the section over here to the bridge, but they didn't finish it until March of 1864, 1 month before the war ended.
And they finished the northern section.
Well, the northern section was finished in 1863.
Okay.
And it was waiting. And probably the trestle here was built first of anything because that was the normal way that railroads would be built. They would first build, what they call grub and grade. They would clear all the trees out, level the rail bed, and grade it, and then put the ties down, lay the tracks down. But in that process, they wanted to have the trestle already ready. So this was probably the first thing that was built.
Okay.
And to build one fast like they wanted to, it would have been timber, not the concrete, because it takes concrete months to set and get hard until it can support a train. And when it's low water here, you can see the cut off vertical pilings that were there to support that bridge, that first bridge.
The original wooden ones.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it was finished, and then by the time it was finished, I say 1 month before the end of the war, well, it became an important connector for freight and people going north and south. And it connected to that East Coast Railroad across Florida, the Pensacola and Gulf and the Florida Central, and it went to Jacksonville. And so this was the main way where people from north and goods from the north would come down, go to Live Oak, be transferred onto the other line, and go to Jacksonville and then on down the coast. And so this was an important connector until 1882, when this railroad, the original railroad here, was bought up by the Savannah, Western, and Florida Railroad, and then in 1888 by the plant railroad system, and then it became part of the whole southeastern network of Atlantic Coast Railroad line.
So what was the original name of the railroad when it was first built?
It was, well, it had two names because the northern part was the Savannah, Albany, and Gulf, and the southern part was the Pensacola and Gulf Railroad. But short when it be
the separating from
yeah,
north and south? Okay.
yeah, and when it became then it was bought up for a brief period of time by what was called the Florida Railroad, and then by the Savannah, Florida, and Western, and then finally by the Atlantic Coast Line Railroad, and that was in 1902.
Okay.
Now the first crossing here, that timber bridge, that would have been narrow gauge, 3-foot wide rails with small cars and small engines. And when the river was low here, I've done some exploring around, and I found both of the 6.5-inch spikes and the 5-inch spikes. The 6.5 are from the subsequent standard gauge, and those small spikes are from the original small gauge railroad. So this probably was rebuilt very rapidly after the Civil War, so that it could carry heavier trains. And when you go down the bank here, you'll find that there are brick piers that were toppled over. So the original timber railroad bridge trestle was replaced by probably a steel span supported on brick piers. Now, there are no photographs of that, but the evidence is here on the riverbank of all the toppled piers.
So then we probably have, what, 4 successions of
yeah,
coming through?
After that, as trains got bigger and heavier, they replaced those brick pilings. They were just toppled over, and they put these massive concrete piers that you see here behind you, one on either side of the river, and with a steel span across there. And those kind of spans can support a steel bridge for about 150 feet, which is about the distance between those. But when they switched from coal and wood-burning steam engines to diesel locomotives, which were much bigger, much heavier, and they were using the standard gauge, 4.5 feet gauge, then they were carrying heavy loads. And so they added this, late in the game, they added this mid-river pier, which is totally different than the others. It's got I-beams reinforcing it so that they could carry heavier loads. And you'll notice the other thing that's curious here is that the whole structure was raised about 5 feet on either side, those extra concrete blocks that are on top of there. And that's probably as a result of either the Great Flood in 1928 or in 1948, because the river would have been above where our heads, where we're standing here. Yes. Yeah. It's amazing. In 1998, we had another great flood, and the rail line going from Jasper to White Springs, after that, they raised it another 3 feet because it was all underwater during that flood. So that's sort of the history of this line. But the second thing that happened after the Civil War was that the spring, which is close by here, Suwannee Spring, became an important tourist destination for people coming, and so they built a station and a freight platform up here about a mile from where we are. And they had a little spur line that went from there down to the spring and the hotel.
Okay. Yeah. And there's nothing left of that hotel, but we're going to go over there and check that out later, correct?
There were 3 hotels in succession there. They all had the unfortunate ending of being burnt down. And in fact, the railroad station as well burnt. So they had a lot of problems here with fires.
Right.
Yeah.
That was somewhat common back then.
The only thing that's left down there are some small cottages that were built in association with the 3rd hotel, and a stone structure, which is on private property there now, which was probably the boiler room for the hotel, where they generated steam and electricity.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to add to this?
Here, not that I can think of.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.